Hello and welcome to another episode of On the Shane Page. Today, we have a special treat for you guys. Johnny's gone. I'm pretty sure I made that joke the last time around and it wasn't really funny then either, but Johnny is still out on paternity leave. And so I am joined by a guest co-host, Eagles Eric. You can give him a follow on Twitter at Eagles X's and O's. He's been very active on Twitter, X, whatever we want to call it, developing web apps and contract projections and nailing a lot of contract projections, by the way, in free agency. So, Eric, glad you're able to join us today. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Excited to be on the show today. Had a bit of a hiatus with some of the video content. Nick and I are working on some stuff for Philly Film Room behind the scenes, but I think I get messages almost every week saying, you got to collab with Shane Half. So here we are, and very excited to get into it.
Yeah, here we are. And I do have to tell you, because I told our Patreon guys that you have a lot of fans in our Patreon Discord server as well. They're constantly posting your stuff, a lot of good stuff there. And they too have been asking for that collab. So we got to get you and Nick all together and do a big show once we get Johnny back too. But today, I didn't know what to call it, so we're just going to call it the State of the Eagles. And, I don't get to have Eric on the show super often, and Johnny and I have talked about a lot of the things this offseason, and we have not yet gotten into the draft. But I wanted to just get your perspective on a lot of things that have transpired since the end of the season. So we've got some questions we're going to run through, and if you guys are watching live here on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, wherever it be, and you want to drop some questions as we go, we can try to get Eric's take on those as well. But let's dive in and let's talk first about the free agency period and some of the losses that the Eagles had. So the Eagles lost a lot of talent this offseason. They lose one starter on the offensive side of the ball in Mekhi Becton. They lose, 4 starters on the defensive side of the ball: Darius Slay, Josh Sweat, Milton Williams, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Which of those losses, or maybe there's another one, but which of those losses do you think will have the biggest impact on the team in 2025?
For me, it's Darius Slay. I think he had an underrated season overall. So many other players in the defensive backfield got a lot of appreciation. Obviously, Quinyon Mitchell and DeJean. But I think Slay may have been near the NFL lead in pass breakups. You can fact check me on that. And perhaps understated is he's a savvy veteran who assuredly helped a lot of the young DBs get up to speed. Of course, Christian Parker deserves credit, the position coach, but Slay before the season said, I'm going to be a mentor to these guys and give them everything. Sometimes veterans are gatekeepers who don't tell the rookies shit because they don't want to lose their spot or something like this. Slay was in this unique position where he knew he was going to be on a different team next year, and it kind of helped those guys get up to speed, and he was pretty good on the field. Even though he probably dropped a series or two every single game, and probably got Isaiah Rodgers paid a few more million when he was out there, he was really good. So that's kind of my take on it. How about yours?
Yeah, I sit in the exact same camp that you do. I mean, obviously, I think Eagles fans overrated Mekhi Becton because, he has the viral blocks against linebackers and things, and he was good at that. And I'm not saying he wasn't, but I just think you can probably be fine plugging a right guard in between Lane Johnson and Cam Jurgens. I think not that Milton Williams wasn't great, but I think he benefited a ton from playing next to Jalen Carter. And, I think there's adequate replacements nearly everywhere except at outside cornerback. And I think Darius Slay is pretty continually underrated by Eagles fans. And, being a cornerback's a tough gig because you really only get your name called when things don't go your way. I mean, there were like whole games where you didn't even talk about Quinyon Mitchell because he just wasn't targeted. And so Slay was targeted a lot this year, and a lot of it was because Quinyon Mitchell was opposite him, not because he had really fallen off. And the injuries were a thing, and I understood that. And I know like he says some things on Twitter and podcasts that fire people up at times, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a huge loss losing Slay, because the Eagles trusted Slay and Quinyon just implicitly, and it allowed them to do so many things with their safeties that you can't necessarily do if you don't trust your guy on an island outside. And so I do think they're going to miss that a lot this year. And I'm really interested to see how cornerback plays out with signing Adoree Jackson, and you have Keely Ringo, and maybe it's a position they'll target in the draft, which we'll get to here in a minute. And I'm just interested to see how that plays out.
Yeah, real quick on that. I'm perhaps noticing that the Eagles are signing the Giants castoffs because perhaps they figured out that the Giants position coaches and development staff is really bad. And there's kind of a hidden potential in there by bringing in guys who have been poorly coached or used incorrectly within the scheme. So hopefully that materializes for Ojulari and Adoree. I bet you Saquon gave them some intel being like, no, this guy's actually good. The D-back coach is just terrible, right?
Yeah.
People are high on Deonte Banks, and look, he's stunk so far in the NFL. So there may be something there. I'm just speculating.
Yeah. Comment here from Yako on YouTube says, interested in hearing thoughts about the Goedert situation in the draft. We are going to get there. But first, Sheldon's asking, does that mean they draft another corner in the first 3 rounds, or does Adoree Jackson or a Ringo competition going to be for boundary corner? So, Eric, if I pressed you right now, who is starting opposite Quinyon Mitchell at the boundary? Is it Adoree Jackson, Keely Ringo, or a rookie?
Ringo. Okay. Yeah. I'll leave it at that for now.
All right. I'm also a big Ringo guy. I've been clamoring for him to get a shot for a while. It just... Obviously, I love Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, so I wasn't sad to see them get drafted last year, but I am ready for Ringo to get a shot as well. So, let's flip that question on its head then. And so, of all the guys that the Eagles lost, or at least the big 5, because I don't want you to answer this question with like Avonte Maddox, but which loss do you think will have the least impact on the team in 2025?
Gardner Johnson.
Okay.
And the reason is because it's kind of alludes back to the point you made earlier, which is Slay kind of goes unnoticed because a lot of plays where you have blanket coverage, you're just off the screen. And unless you're watching the All-22, you have no idea. Gardner Johnson's the opposite, and he's always inserting himself in the action, but sometimes to a detriment. So his flash plays look amazing, and the fans get extremely excited, and he lets everyone know that he made the big play. But going and watching the film, and this is just a objective, quantitative measure, he had more breakdowns, whether it was run fits or in coverage, than anyone else in the secondary, or any other normal starter, not named Avonte Maddox. So by that measure, I'd say we're not going to feel his loss. I think his energy and passion will be easily replaced by some of the other guys they have on the defense who definitely have that characteristic to them, and they just may become more vocal next season. So who do you think?
Yeah, I remember like at some point midway through the season on a film show with Johnny suggesting that Chauncey Gardner-Johnson should be benched because of how poor his play was. And I do think it got better as the year went along. I think Eagles fans overrate the impact of Chauncey Gardner-Johnson because he does make flash plays that you notice watching the game. And he makes a lot of bad plays you don't notice unless you're watching that All-22 or unless they draw it up on the screen during the broadcast. The only thing that gives me hesitancy to say Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is the fact that when a safety went down, Avonte Maddox was the next guy up instead of Sidney Brown. And so maybe it's Brown working back from injury and he just wasn't fully there. They didn't trust it. But whatever it was, because Maddox certainly didn't thrive at safety, it does make me a little nervous about the position. It makes me want to say Becton, but I think I agree with you that it's either Chauncey Gardner-Johnson or Becton. And I do think Tyler Steen is going to be able to step in there. I hope that did start to waver a little bit in some of his extended action, but those are the two spots for me that it's toss up between them.
Yeah, and Becton's a tricky one because there were plays where he threw the defensive lineman completely out of the club and sprung long touchdowns. But there were times where he got beat by lateral quickness from interior rushers. And so Steen, to me, is kind of the opposite. He won't throw anyone out, but he's not going to be beat by speed in the pass rush. So ultimately, how does that, factor out? My guess is maybe you have a little less explosive runs, but maybe you have, less pressures on Jalen Hurts. So I can't really make a conclusion on how much overall impact that will be, as much as I could say, they're probably going to find another safety outside of Sidney Brown to kind of replace CJ. And Fangio's so particular with his safeties that I think they will invest a decent amount in it, not just throw a random replacement level player in there.
Yeah, and with Mekhi Becton, had he walked for $5 million a year, I probably would have been frustrated with that, but I wouldn't have paid Becton $10 million a year like the Chargers did. So I think the Eagles ultimately made the right call there. But if I were to put you in Howie Roseman's chair, it's the start of the free agency period, but you've seen into the future. You know exactly what contract everybody's going to sign, which you were pretty close anyways with your projection tool. But of the guys that the Eagles lost, which, if any, would you have retained at the contract they signed at their new place? So you've got Milton Williams, $26 million a year. I'll just run through the list. You can tell me yes or no. Milton Williams, $26 million a year.
Absolutely not. No.
Yeah. Josh Sweat, $19 million a year.
No.
Darius Slay, $10 million a year.
It's close. I'm more like $8 million. But it's close. And his was multi-year, correct?
I believe it's just, at least on Spot Track, it's showing 1 year, 10 from the Steelers.
I probably would have done that.
Yeah. For me, it's between him or Isaiah Rodgers at 2 years, $5.5 million. Yeah. I would have kept one of the two at that price, depending on how I probably would have kept Rodgers at that, just because he's younger and he was cheaper, and it still gives you the chance for Keely Ringo could go win this job, but if he doesn't, we've got good depth. But I would have kept one of those two guys. I think I would have leaned towards Rodgers.
Yeah, Rodgers at 5. I kind of jumped the gun. I was going to say a vehement yes when you got to Rodgers. He was one guy I've actually looked at this, which is relative to their impact on the field and their contract, which guys are kind of delivering the most surplus value in the NFL. Isaiah Rodgers, if he is gets a full allotment of snaps and plays how he has the last year in Indy and then last year, that is one of the best contracts in all of football. So it's easily a slam dunk. There must be something behind the scenes, maybe he's not as locked in film study, or they didn't like him at the catch point, or he wasn't willing to tackle. They wanted to make him a nickel and he said no. I think there's a little bit more to the story than just we don't think his on-field play was worth $5.5 million.
Yeah, I think there's also the potential that he wanted to go somewhere where he was guaranteed to start, and the Slay stuff was still up in the air, and they did have Keely Ringo, and so I think that could have been a motivating factor as well.
And Minnesota is a unbelievable landing spot for him.
Yeah,
they're going to get him. He'll probably get a lot of ball production this year.
Yeah. So we already mentioned Becton at $10 million. You said you wouldn't have done that. Oren Burks, 2 years, $2.5 million.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. And before the season, my surprise starter on defense was Oren Burks. That was before we found out Zach Bond was going to be off-ball linebacker. Then he got hurt, kind of fell out of favor, but then he came back in the playoffs and played really good. So I felt pretty vindicated once that happened. And because they have one starting caliber linebacker healthy to start next season, I would have paid that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I definitely would have too. And I wonder again if for him, it's just he wanted to go somewhere where he was pretty much going to have a starting role, and the Eagles might not have been offering that, because I do have concerns about Nakobe Dean's injury, and then I mean I love Trotter. Everybody in Philadelphia loves Trotter, but I'm a little concerned about him in his second year being like, "Yep, that's just our starter week one," with no real competition. So that's one to watch out for. Kenny Gainwell, 1 year, $1.8 million to the Steelers.
No. Sorry. I like Gainwell, but I specifically thought this is one of the deepest running back draft classes in recent memory, and I would love to target a guy around round 5. And we have 4 round 5 picks, so
yeah. Okay. Avonte Maddox, 1 year, $1.4 million.
No. I said I wouldn't even keep him for free. So
yeah. All right. And then the last one, Fred Johnson, 1 year, $1.3 million to the Jags.
Actually, yes. I think he's a useful swing tackle, and he's got the ability to kind of play decent against a wide variety of edge players, whether they're speed or power. We've seen guys in the past like Driscoll who couldn't block either type of edge rusher. So I probably would have paid that. Now, my guess is they really like Kennard, or they know they're going to draft a guy. So that's probably why they let him go.
Yeah. And I've also wondered if they end up drafting a guy that takes the right guard job, if Tyler Steen doesn't just become like your swing tackle. Because he played, I think it was left tackle at Alabama. Actually, he might have played both tackle positions at Alabama. I can't remember now, but I know he played tackle coming out and was kind of projected to be an interior guy because of his size and arm length. And I mean, at the end of the day, if you could do worse than Tyler Steen as a backup for 4 offensive line positions on your team. So I could see a scenario like that playing out for the Eagles as well.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, all right. And someone asked about Pryor. He's on the Bears. So he's not even on the Eagles, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't seen him back in Philly. So yeah. I thought, didn't he go to the Bears in free agency like a couple years ago?
Well, he's not on the Eagles, right?
No, I don't think so. I'm going to look it up now.
Oh, they just signed him. Okay. It flew under my radar. So, okay.
Oh, did they?
You go. So, starting right guard, Matt Pryor, I doubt it. Probably not. So, one guy who is not being discussed is Trevor Keegan. He may win the job.
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah. All right. Well, let's go to another topic that's been all over Twitter, and Nick even made a video on it for Philly Film Room talking about the Dallas Goedert situation. And there's been lots of smoke about a Dallas Goedert trade or Dallas Goedert being cut. He's headed into the final year of his contract. And I just want to get your take on that situation. What do you think happens with Dallas Goedert, and how would you handle it if you were the Eagles?
All the indications from public, guys who are close to the team and what the front office guys have said themselves are indicating he's probably on his way out. And they are pretty reliable. Like if they're going to keep a guy, maybe it's a little less clear about what they're going to do because, maybe they're fielding trade offers or something like that. But the writing is on the wall. So I do think he's gone. He's a player you'd love to have, obviously, for what he can do in the pass and run game. He won them games single-handedly. He have like the receiving lead in the playoffs. So yeah, awesome player. Loved him coming out of college. Obviously, his availability issues are the big detractor here. And that makes, to me, the dead cap they would incur in 2026, 2027 if they kept him not worth it. They can save a net of $15.5 million over those 2 years. And can that be allocated in a way that makes the team better than Goedert playing 10 games? My guess is probably. But you need a tight end. If you just go out there with Calcaterra and Harrison Bryant, you're going to feel the pain of that. So that's where you may need to invest in the draft or orchestrate a trade. So what's your take on it?
Yeah, I would like to see him back. I know like the salary situation, like, and for those of you playing along at home, I think Eric's tweeted about it. I've tweeted about it as well, but it basically breaks down to, and getting into Spot Track and Over the Cap and looking at Eagles contracts is really difficult because how he structures contracts in a way that is really hard for them to reflect. But it basically breaks down to a $21 million dead cap hit this year if he's gone, or they keep him, and then the next year they basically have to take care of those cap hits anyways. And so it breaks down to that $15.5 million difference. So it essentially boils down to like, that's sunk money. Do you want Dallas Goedert for 1 year, $15.5 million? And no, that's not his exact salary, but that's what it breaks down to. And to me, like this is a Super Bowl window. And I think Super Bowls come in windows. I think you're in one for the next couple of seasons. And I think you can go too far in one direction of like, let's push all the chips into the table and win one in 2025. And that's what I thought the Myles Garrett trade rumors would be. If you're trading multiple first round picks for Myles Garrett, extending him, like to me, that's too far in one direction. You just won a Super Bowl without him. You don't have to go that all in. That's reckless. And I think you can go too far the other direction where you're like, yeah, but we still want to be Super Bowl contenders in 2032. And so I think it's finding that balance. For me, I would love to keep Goedert for another year. I think he makes such an impact on the team. Out of 11 personnel, I believe it was, that he had the most yards or second most yards per route run of qualifying tight ends from 11 personnel. The Eagles rushing yards per attempt is like a 1.5 yard difference when he's on the field. And so he brings so much as a blocker, and he can do all these different things. And I firmly believe that if healthy and in an offense that didn't feature A.J. Brown, he would be widely seen as a top 2 or 3 tight end. That said, $15.5 million is a lot of money. And so I get it, I guess. And it seems like it's the writing's on the wall, but it's going to be a hard pill for me to swallow when he's gone, especially if it's just an outright cut or like a 5th round draft pick or something like that, because I think he's so valuable to the team. And I've watched Grant Calcaterra try to block too many times. Like there's got to be some other move at tight end. And maybe they go do something in the draft that makes me more okay with it. And that's certainly a possibility. But as the roster is constructed right now, I just think it opens a pretty big hole if you move on from Goedert.
And the thing is, elite tight ends, they're not replaceable. They don't go on the open market, and you have a heck of a time investing a premium pick on one. You're not very likely to get an elite tight end like in the 3rd or 4th round. Yes, there are exceptions. But today's day and age, you probably are going to have to go in the top 2 rounds. That's Loveland is maybe in the range for a small trade up. And then you got Mason Taylor, who likely would be targeted in the 2nd round. And those guys would go a long way to mitigating the impact of a Goedert loss. But neither of them are remotely close as an inline blocker. And that, to me, is maybe where Goedert has the most value. Yes, he's great at receiving, but they don't scheme him up anyway. So, and the blocking tight ends, like Jackson Hawes, a guy who maybe is a 5th or 6th rounder, he doesn't offer hardly anything in the pass game. Once you stop spending a premium pick on a tight end, you probably are getting either a pure receiver or a pure blocker. So that it just makes it tough. And Mason Taylor might be a guy who kind of is capable of both, just not to the level of Goedert. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the draft, and let's segue into that conversation here. And let's just assume Goddard's gone, because that seems like what's going to happen. Assuming Goddard is out, what do you see as the position or two that are the biggest needs for the Eagles heading into the draft?
So I kind of have a different way of looking at this. I think about what the team is going to look like out on the field and how they can be most effective, as opposed to like, oh, they clearly have a hole at tight end and safety and they need to patch those holes. And because of that, I think sometimes about bolstering strengths, and defensive line to me is where I would target early in the draft for sure. Now the counter argument is there's so many interior defensive linemen in this draft, and to some extent edge rushers, that you could wait for one. But if you want a guy who has pass rush juice and can stay on the field on early downs, you're probably going to have to invest a high pick. So everyone knows we lost some really good guys from the defensive line. You're going to have guys coming up for big extensions. Davis is probably not going to get his 18 to 20 million when he's up. So to me, you got to restock the coffers. Edge and interior defensive line are both, to me, huge targets. And then let's call it the second to fourth round, that's where you go and look at tight end and safety. So what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if a guy like Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland was there, I would think about that. Well, Tyler Warren won't even be in the vicinity of 32, but if a guy like Colston Loveland was there and Goddard was gone, I would think about that pretty long and hard. But I really like the idea of bringing in an interior defensive line player that can rush the passer opposite Jalen Carter, because I just think like Jalen Carter is a force multiplier. And so the fact that he is there is going to make another interior player better than they actually are. And so if we can get a guy that's good to start with and then put him next to Jalen Carter, it just multiplies that. And you saw the impact in the Super Bowl that quick, and that's what people said for years about that's how you beat Tom Brady, quick interior pressure. Well, they said that because Brady didn't really have a weakness, but quick interior pressure is the death nail for all quarterbacks, and the Eagles have a chance to really double down on that. So, and then edge rusher. I mean, you lose Brandon Graham, you lose Josh Sweat, Bryce Huff didn't pan out, so there's some definite needs there. So I'm in agreement with you on that. I would like safety, but I just don't think that's something the Eagles would do. Of course, last offseason, I said hours before the Saquon Barkley signing broke that I'd be very surprised if Howie Roseman signed Saquon Barkley to a big deal, and I would have not believed you if you told me he was going to sign a top-of-the-market linebacker this offseason either. So who knows what Howie's going to do. But if you were in the position, you're saying edge and interior defensive lineman, and who's a player that you think makes sense at 32, or maybe a small trade up, whatever, but in the first round for each of those positions?
Yeah. Oh, and real quick on that, I 100% agree with you about those contracts, but there's context that needs to be added, which is Saquon will be earning 2.4% of the cap this year. So top of the market, especially with Howie structures, is still extremely cheap, even though they just handed him that bonus money for no reason at all other than a thank you. So just real quick on that. Players that make sense in the first round for each of those positions. Edge rusher. Do you want like a little synopsis on each, or not really?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So edge rusher, James Pierce Jr. This guy, if there were no football character concerns, would be a top 10 pick in every single draft. No questions asked. But there are concerns, whether it's love of football from what I've seen. So it's like, is he going to spend the extra time to put in film study? Thankfully, edge rushers need the least amount of film study. Is he going to be giving his 100% on every snap? In what I watched, his effort level was fairly good. Nothing where I'd be like giving him a huge red flag. And he has world-class around the edge burst. So he's just an unbelievable athlete. And he had 2 years in a row, the advanced analytics show his production was the best in the entire SEC. All signs point to this guy being really good to translate to the NFL. Even though he's slender, he has enough pop in his hands and a decent anchor to hold up in the run game. It's not like he's a designated pass rusher only. Now, here's the thing. He doesn't have many moves. So to me, he is pretty raw as a prospect, and he still had that production. And he still has some of the best athleticism in the NFL from day one. So if he drops to 32, you interview him and you're like, okay, he's good to go. We don't anticipate that he's going to like start hating football and not try after 2 years. It's a slam dunk. Should I go to the next one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Walter Nolan. I mean, this might be one of my favorite guy in the entire draft. When I first watched him, I watched the game that was like week 8 or something like that. And every single snap, he stood straight up like the nutcracker and got walled off and pushed out of the play. And I was like, why is everyone excited about this guy? He stinks. And then obviously later on, you go and you watch more. And it turned out it was only a problem later in the season. And it's something I've talked about a little bit on Twitter. And some of his flashes early in the season are unbelievable. Now, when Jalen Carter came out, I said, this is the best interior defensive lineman I've ever scouted. And I didn't start scouting until after Aaron Donald came, so that's not even a factor. He's not Jalen Carter, but his flashes are up there with some of the best interior rushers I've watched. Incredible burst, lateral agility, insane power. His pedigree is extremely high. Now, he didn't play quite to the level of competition in high school that some of these other elite interior defensive linemen did, but his production was off the charts. I think he had 17 sacks in his last season in high school, and you'd be amazed how well the high school senior season production correlates to what guys do in the NFL. From interior defensive linemen specifically. It's a research project I'm working on right now. And so all signs point to, as long as this guy, another guy who may drop because of football character concerns, other stuff that the public is not aware of until Dane Brugler maybe writes about it in The Beast. If that stuff checks out and is not an issue, I mean, he's unbelievable. Now, here's the thing. If that stuff does check out, I think he'll go high in the draft, like maybe 17 to the Cardinals. Somehow he's there at 25. I'm moving everything from 2026. I'm moving my 3rd round pick, my 4th round pick. I don't care because they're getting comp picks back anyway to move up to get this guy. And you talked about force multiplier with Carter. I mean, them two together, it's insane. You have the new Bash brothers. So Walter Nolan, one of my favorite players in the draft. Tight end, you talked about him, Colston Loveland. He has a little bit more juice as an inline blocker than I think people give him credit for. He's a big guy. He's a legit 6'4" and almost 6'5". He's a legit 245 pounds. And he was coached at Michigan. And so like his technique obviously needs development, but it's not like as bad as some of these other guys like Harold Fanning or something like that. So I think he could be adequate as a blocker, better than Calcaterra for sure. And he's better than Goedert as a receiver. You're talking, I think he's better than Sam Laporta coming out as a receiver. Right away, he's a Trey McBride level receiver coming out day one as a tight end. And that, now here's the trick. Is there enough passes to go around to justify that? My answer is no. especially the way Hurts operates, you're just not going to get the receiving value that you should based off what Loveland's capable of. But if something happened where they changed their offense and did get more targets to those players, then yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah.
And last safety I'll talk about. Now, this is because it's first round only. It would be Malachi Starks. There's only really like 2 realistic first round safety picks, him and Eamon Worry. I just put out an Eamon Worry scouting report on Twitter. Everyone should go check that out if they're interested in more detail. But I think he has a long way to go before he's a polished NFL safety. So much so that he may not be a deep safety at all, maybe more of a hybrid player who's in the box and takes zone snaps from the nickel slot and stuff like that. At times, really slow to react, really bad change of direction with his high cut frame. So once he's moving in one direction and he needs to cut back against the grain, it takes a year and a day. So when he's going in a straight line, he's unmatched. I called him the DK Metcalf of safeties, and he can go up and climb the ladder and make interceptions and bat away passes, but I really don't think he's refined. That's why I say Malachi Starks. Now, Starks, to me, he's like built in a lab in terms of like his football, functional athleticism, his frame, and all that kind of stuff. Initially, when I was watching him, I was like, wow, this guy is one of the best safety prospects I've ever watched. But as I watched more, I thought his instincts were not quite as elite as I initially thought. I'd say they're more good than great, but he seems to have the intangibles and the frame and functional athleticism that if he can improve his instincts and you give him a Vic Fangio, then I think he would be like an all-pro level safety. He is the kind of guy, though, that if he goes to like a bad system, he might not live up to his draft slot. So that's kind of who I've picked out for those 4 positions.
All right. Real quickly, let's go to a question here. How likely is this draft outcome? At pick 32, the best player available on the defensive line, pick 64, Mason Taylor, and pick 96, Kevin Winston Jr. What are the chances that plays out that way, Eric?
That sounds really reasonable to me. In terms of like the specific players at the specific spots, it's like a deck of cards. Mm-hmm. Every random combination is just as likely as another. But what the players that they've laid out there at those positions make a lot of sense and fit the Eagles' needs. There's kind of a lie told around the NFL that like you don't draft for need, you go best play, and then you look and like 90% of the teams like clearly draft for need for every single pick. So like yeah, I think that looks really reasonable.
Yeah. All right. Well, you've talked about some guys that you like. Talk to me now. Give me a couple names of guys you think are being overrated right now in the draft process, whether it be by Eagles fans or national media or whatever. Who's a few guys you think are being overrated?
Well, I just talked about one, Nick Eamon Worry. When I first scouted him, he was considered a 3rd round pick by the consensus big boards. And I was like, dang, I like this guy. And now he's considered to be a fringe 1st rounder. And I'm like, ugh, that's not what I want. And there's a second part of this, which is not only is he a unrefined prospect, but I've done a research project I just posted on Twitter yesterday about surplus value, which is, had this player been on the open market, what could they expect to get paid? And given their draft position, what are they getting paid? And then you look at the delta between those and you see like, how much money are you potentially saving by getting this guy? Eamon Worry, if he was drafted in the 1st round, he would already be paid higher than some starting safeties out there. And he probably needs 2 to 3 years of development before he reaches, his potential. And even if he does all that, he would only be getting paid 14 to 15 million on the open market. Whereas you hit on a defensive lineman or tackle or receiver, and they're in the 25 million plus range. So then you can take that surplus value and allocate it to other parts of your team that have holes in them, and you can actually get good players. So you want to maximize impact too. This is why, you can justify drafting Jahmyr Gibbs at 12th overall, because he made their offense so much better, even though he gave them no surplus value. It's still worth it. Sometimes it's worth sacrificing the monetary gain. All that to say, Eamon to me, people are overselling his football instincts. I've heard comments about he's quick to identify offensive concepts. I've identified him as a player who guesses a lot. It's kind of like sitting on a fastball and then boom, and it's like, oh wow, he's so good at reading the pitch. It's like, no, he's just sitting on fastball. So I think Eamon sits on certain things and looks like he has great instincts, even though he doesn't. Matthew Golden, I never understood why he was considered a player who could go now top 15 is some of his projections. He doesn't play to the speed on film. Something I talked about was Xavier Worthy last year. He has a small catch radius. He's a small player. And I think he'll struggle with physicality. And his best asset is if he's kind of running these sideline routes deep down the field. This means he has to be paired with a strong arm quarterback who can laser it deep down the field to the sideline, where he can really like exploit some zone coverages or slower players in man. So he's so situation specific that I think he might underwhelm dramatically. Derek Harmon is a very interesting one, and I've warmed up to him a lot.
I like Derek Harmon quite a bit.
When I first watched him, and this is something I made a concerted effort to do this year, which is not get anchored to my initial opinion about a player. I will have a completely blank slate now. I'll maybe watch like 2 or 3 games, put them on the back burner, come back a few weeks later and watch 2 or 3 different games. And I try to pretend like it's the first time I'm seeing them. And the first time I watched him, I was like slow out of his stance. His pressures are low quality. He benefited from a bunch of other guys on his line, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, he's a nice player, but definitely not worth a first rounder pick. And then I watched some more and I'm like, okay, he actually shows snaps where he has a lot of burst off the line. So I kind of identified him as a guy who's conserving energy, and or the way they're coaching that defense is they want to control gaps off the snap. And there's so much window dressing. There's so much zone read and screens and fake bullshit in college that sometimes if you just are a pure penetrator, you can get victimized. So I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that some of it was scheme specific, and the flashes are examples of that he's capable of more. His main issue is that his finishing ability is suspect because he's really top heavy. And so if he's if say the quarterback's right in front of me and I'm going, and then he moves off his line, he's just really tough time trying to like change directions and corral the quarterback. And even though his length on paper is extremely high, I think 90th something percentile, it doesn't show up on film. Something with his shoulder pads kind of blocking his ability to kind of fully reach out and grasp players. I don't know to the extent of how much that could be improved. So when I hear Derek Harmon 17th overall, I think overrated. When I hear 32nd to the Eagles, and next to Jalen Carter, I'm like, all right, because he offers way more pass rush upside than a guy like Alfred Collins, and he offers way more in run defense than a guy like Omar Norman Lott. So the combination of his abilities probably does make him worth it. So I know this was the overrated segment, but I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about him because I do think he might be someone quite high on the Eagles board and a realistic option at 32. And I'll finish with Landon Jackson. So I recently watched a Greg Cosell video, and it was funny. Every single player he specifically identified as guys he loved was guys I hated. So we'll see who's right. And Landon Jackson is a player who destroyed Will Campbell. So I'll just come right out of the gate and say, like, yes, he's capable of beating good linemen. But on a down-to-down basis, his pass rush ability is terrible. People say bad pad level. It's unavoidable. He's 6'7". He cannot play with good leverage. As soon as a guy gets in this area, he's toast. He cannot get off the block, which is why he has this extremely violent cross chop move that he uses every single rush, because he knows if the guy actually latches onto him, he's completely toast. I hate rushers whose pass rush completely fizzles out if they don't win on their first shot. Now, it's ironic that he has a high motor. So, like, yeah, he can still make cleanup sacks, even though his rushes fizzle out. It's a little bit of a paradox with that. And I think he has a really good anchor and motor and run defense too. So he's a useful player, but the idea of drafting him like in the second round or higher seems insane to me, especially with all the other edge rushers out there. His on-field athleticism doesn't even remotely sniff what his testing numbers were. You look at his RES, it looks like he's Myles Garrett. You watch him on the field, and he's one of the stiffest, slowest edge rushers out there. Also, I don't think Will Campbell is as good as a tackle as people are saying. So that may explain why he was able to beat him repeatedly. So those are some of the players I've identified as overrated.
All right. Well, last question before I let you go. Give me a guy or two, whatever, that is a day 2 or a day 3 guy that you think you like their fit specifically with the Eagles. So what are a couple of names that you're looking at on day 2 and 3 that you'd love to see in Midnight Green?
Yeah. And I wrote down 5 names here, and they're all players that are realistic options that the Eagles potentially have had meetings with. So Braden Swinson, edge rusher out of LSU. He's a guy who can play all 3 downs. He's a guy who has good burst off the snap and extremely advanced hand usage. We talked about Landon Jackson's cross chop. Well, this guy's got every hand move in the arsenal you could possibly imagine, which makes it much harder for the tackles to predict what he's going to do. So they're off balance, which means they're more susceptible to being beat around the edge through their chest or on inside counters. So it's kind of a multiplicative effect. And he may be available at 64. Maybe I'm crazy and the NFL is like, wait, this guy's blatantly good, had 2-year production in the SEC, and he'll end up going like 40th. But I definitely like his tape. Interior defensive line, we already touched on this guy, Alfred Collins. He was a late bloomer, but I mean, he's pretty much impossible to get any knockback off the line and run defense. He can control 2 gaps. He does exactly what Jordan Davis is asked to do when he's on the field in those base fronts. I think he has a little bit more pass rush juice than people give him credit for. He's not like lumbering and unathletic. He kind of just is like, I'm here to stop the run. But if he was given more like true pass set rush opportunities, I think he'd show a little bit more. Now, he's not nearly what Derek Harmon is in the pass rush department, but it's not a 0. And just his ability to absorb double teams and hold his ground and control 2 gaps and also tackle. So that's one of the problems with Harmon is he could be in the perfect position to miss the tackle. Collins lays out, latches on, and rarely misses. And I love that about his game. Tight end, Mason Taylor. We talked about him. He could play inline or detached. And he seems like he has a lot more receiving ability than he was even able to showcase in college. He's got an unbelievable pedigree, as Nick alluded in his Philly Film Room video. He just released a video the other day on Mason Taylor I recommend watching. So definitely a guy I would look out for, and I believe they've already met with him. Safety, Kevin Winston Jr. I am currently still watching his tape, so I don't have a fully formed scouting report on him, but the early stuff I watched from 2023 was extremely impressive. His athleticism's off the charts. He potentially could be good in the run and pass game, but injuries have derailed him and might push him down the board. Andrew Makuba is a guy who the Eagles have met with and would make a lot of sense. Now, I first started off kind of being obsessed with this guy because he had some unbelievable snaps in pass coverage where he identified concepts where they were trying to like have eye candy down low and like hold the middle safety and then run some kind of dig behind him, and he's seeing it before it happens and jumping the route and making interceptions, and that stuff gets you excited, especially at high level college. But then I watch more and I'm like, this guy's tippy toeing if there's a big back in the open field. He's 186 pounds, soaking wet. He does make booming hits on like unsuspecting receivers coming across the middle, driving hard on those plays. But like if he's flat-footed and a big guy's barreling him his way, whether they're trying to block him or run over him, watch out. He's in trouble. So I do have big concerns about him in like run defense or some kind of against heavy packages if he's asked to like mark a tight end. But he still has game. If he can put on 10 pounds and kind of make his technique so he's not as skittish in the run fits and like kind of can do rugby style tackling or something like that, I think that would go a long way. And last guy, we got to show some love to the trenches, Charles Grant, a guy with unbelievable measurables out of William and Mary. They've met with him. I think he was a 30 visit. And he potentially has guard tackle versatility. He's billed as a raw prospect, but then you put on the tape and he actually is not raw. He has a wrestling background. Late to the game. I think he started late in high school. Really quick to pick up the learning curve at tackle. He actually looks pretty polished. Not dissimilar to Amarius Mims, but in the guard profile where people pretended like he was super raw and had unbelievable measurables, and in 5 years he'll be an all-pro, and then it was like he was already good year one. I think Charles Grant might kind of be that for guards. So those were 5 guys I thought I mentioned. I see a comment. Someone said I'm late. I'm assuming they'll be able to watch this.
Yes.
Right later. So
yeah, it'll be up on YouTube, and I'll have it out on our podcast feed later this afternoon as well. So yeah, my bad, Gigi, and we moved up the time, and I forgot to let Shane the Discord know.
I want to hear some of your day 2, day 3 prospects that you like.
Yeah, Charles Grant's one of them. I was going through offensive line stuff, putting together my rankings for our Armchair Scout show this week. We recorded that Tuesday night. It just released today, and I texted or I messaged in our chat, and I said, I found the offensive lineman I want the Eagles to draft. And Dibes was like, it's Charles Grant. And I was like, yes, it is. Like, so I'm all aboard the Charles Grant train. I would love to get Charles Grant. I mean, depending on like where we're talking, but if you want to go linebacker, I'm a bit biased, but I love Danny Stutzman. Of course, I'm an OU fan, and he's like the heart and soul of OU's defense. But I really like Danny Stutzman. I think he could be a guy that could be a good fit in Philly. Let's see. I'm just looking at my board here, trying to think. I didn't prepare for this question. Okay. I like Gunnar Helm too. If you want to go a little more of a blocker tight end that I still think has some receiving ability. I think he's kind of like the inverse of Mason Taylor in that like he's a good blocker, but I think he probably offers more as a receiver than he really showed in college. I could see him being a guy that could make sense for the Eagles.
Yeah, and people think that he's extremely unathletic because his ankle blew up and he ran the worst 40 of all time. But you watch his film and he's juking guys out of his shoes on the regular. So I think he's a specific guy where you line him up detached and ask him to win on an out route against man coverage. It's not going to happen. But you design a split zone action where he's feeding across the line of scrimmage, and then you hit him in the flats, and then he's one-on-one against the nickelback in the open field, and they think he's going to truck him, and then he jukes him. Like, that's where I like him. And he's a big target to like sit down in between zones. And as you mentioned, he has blocking juice. I think this guy, the best thing that could have happened for the Eagles is he tested horribly. He might drop to like the 5th round, and then you're getting a guy who probably should have gone in the 3rd had that not happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's another guy that he just screams perfect fit for the Eagles to me, because he's from Georgia and he's got over 2,000 snaps in his career at right guard. Tate Ratledge, I think, would be a great fit in Philadelphia. Give you some. He's like, if you talk about you're not sure about Tyler Steen, I think Tate Ratledge is pro ready. Like, I think you can plug him into nearly any scheme that you want at right guard and he's ready to start. Like, I think he'd be a little better in like a gap scheme, but I'm not overly concerned about him in a zone scheme. And, the Eagles like to do a lot of different things in the run game. And I really like Tate Ratledge. And I tend to lean on like linemen because I'm just preparing myself for the Eagles to draft them, because it's how the Eagles, like to construct their drafts. But on the line, Grant and Ratledge are big guys that I really like. I like Helm at tight end. I like Danny Stutzman at linebacker. Those are some of like my day 2-3 pet guys that I'd be thrilled to see.
And if you look at who the Eagles are bringing in for these visits, a lot of these offensive linemen are going to be in that 96 to 64-ish range. Maybe it's a trade up from 96. Maybe it's you stick and pick at 64. Maybe you trade 2026 picks and get a whole new pick up in that range. So I think it's highly likely that somewhere, let's call it between pick 50 and pick 96, the Eagles will address offensive line. And I think they're going to like that guy, Marcus Bowe. So we'll just I'll be able to post this clip later when they draft him. So
there you go. See, that's the trick in draft season is you need to mention as many names as you can as fits, and then you can go back and find the appropriate clips after the draft.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
All right. Well, I think that is going to about do it for, I don't know, our State of the Eagles podcast, I guess is what we can call this one. Eric, thanks so much for joining us. Before we get out of here, tell everybody where they can find you and what projects you've got going on, because I know you've got a lot of stuff in the hopper over on Twitter.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter at Eagles X's and O's. That's where I put most of my stuff. And then Nick and I at Philly Film Room will be working on some videos. We have some stuff behind the scenes we're working on, kind of expanding our presence. And I am working on some research projects, as you just alluded to. And one of them, I will tease it here for the first time, this has never been mentioned, is a tool that will identify trade opportunities in the NFL by finding teams that have surplus positional talent and then a hole, and then finding a matching team with, the opposite pair. Where, for example, the Eagles need a edge rusher, but we have a lot of good. I don't know if the Eagles are the best example because they don't have that much depth currently. But just for example, let's pretend that they had another stud receiver that they could move. So it'll find pairs in the NFL. And so look for that in the next month. I'm going to put out a tool where you can play around and find like potential trade partners for any two NFL teams.
All right. Awesome. Well, you guys be sure you check out Eric's stuff on Twitter at Eagles X's and O's. Go subscribe to the Philly Film Room on YouTube if you're not. Nick does great work. Eric's on there. I was going to say Eric's on there as well. It makes it sound like Eric doesn't do great work. They both do great work. So go check out their stuff as they kind of kick into off-season mode and draft mode over the next few weeks. But thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode. Be sure you leave a 5-star rating and review on the Eagles Pinpool Network, wherever you get your podcasts. Johnny will be back next week. We're going to dive into, I think, maybe a mailbag and some other things and start to get into our Eagles draft fits, and all the other shows on the network will keep rolling along. Armchair Scouts is going to finish up our positional rankings with defensive backs. And then we will have covered every position for the draft. And, there's a lot of shows coming out every day. So make sure you are subscribed to that, and we will catch you guys next time for another episode of On the Shane Page.